Hello, and welcome to the Mixtapes podcast, where we share the stories of mixed race, biracial people, and interracial couples and relationships. I'm one of your co hosts, Nikki, joined by my co host, Amber. Hi, Amber. So good to see you. And we're also joined by a special guest, Miss Rebecca Green. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Yay. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited to have you here. And something we do before we jump into our conversation today and hear about your story as a mixed race person is we love to share something good. So, your something good can be either something you're looking forward to in the future, or goal you might have, or it can be something that has already happened recently that you're like, I'm riding this wave because it was so good. So, take a moment to think about what yours might be before I kick it over to my friend Amber. Amber, what's your something good?
So speaking of riding a wave, I am riding this wave of a show that you actually recommended that I watch called Forever. I actually just watched it over the weekend when I was trying to rest and really rest. I'm really trying to rest, y'all. And it was so like healing for my soul to watch a show that had like predominantly Black characters and being shown in a light that wasn't like, gun violence or police brutality or like losing like a loved one to like gang violence or something random that they like kind of depict in a lot of Black film. And it was created by a Black producer. And she just did a beautiful job at telling the story of like a Black love story of teenagers and then also like all these other Black couples that were just in love and like showing like a child like like a kid with like really strong parent unit and another kid with a single mom but like wasn't like a single mom because the dad wasn't around. Dad was around, but in like a different capacity. It was just so beautiful and uplifting, and it just healed something in me while I was watching it. That like I don't know. I really appreciate. I want to watch more like that. I want to like read more, literature like that where we're just really like, especially like people of color are being shown in like these really positive lights. Where it's like we all definitely have drama in our life and we deal with problems, but it's so nice to see like we don't have to have the excess of like, having to battle all these other outside influences or how the media wants to portray some of our experiences. So I just loved it. And I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it, Rebecca.
Take a look. Yeah, I've heard of it. I'm excited to dive in. I love the idea. I think I read something about it just being like it's just a love story between teenagers basically and that as somebody who grew up in the years of blonde-haired, blue-eyed stars only, like it was so nice. It is so nice to see like that that relationship being portrayed not just like a teen pregnancy story or you know what I mean? And I think that is well, even if that I haven't seen it, so even that if that's becomes a part of it, it's like so beautiful that it's just normalized like two teenagers, because that's the reality versus what
Yeah,
we've always been shown about ourselves for years and years.
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you'll really like it. It's really cute. Like, and everything that you just said about like how you feel like it is true. Like, and what Amber said is true. Like, it's just a cute little love story between two kids who are both Black, and like I felt like it was such a good like homage to Black culture without it being corny. Like, you know how sometimes they just
Mhm.
try to make it like they just overdo it, and it wasn't like that at all. It was too, and one of the kids is like really affluent, and there's a lot of like Black wealth and Black excellence and like that whole thing. So that was really cool to see too. Like, he lives in like a mansion, and like his parents buy
Mhm.
him a really nice car. It's just cool. Like, it's just nice. And it's a cute little love story. So, and Amber, I remember you saying, because I had texted you like, oh, like the ending is so sad. It got me beat up. And you were like, please, not this to be like a police killing or, and I was like, no, I promise it's not traumatic. It's just sad. It's not traumatic.
I was worried. There was like a
And
scene where he
rightfully
was like,
so.
the police were about to like, we thought the police were gonna pull him over, and he doesn't get pulled over, and you're like holding your breath, like, oh gosh, it's
Hmm.
going down, and
Hmm.
it didn't happen. I'm not trying to ruin it, but like just to be able to watch a movie with two teenagers or just two people in love, and it just be like the trials and tribulations of falling in love, and that was it. Was like, okay, so that's my something good.
Amazing.
What about
Yeah.
you, Nikki? What's your something good?
That's a really good something good. And on a similar but not similar note, my something good is on Saturday, I'm going to see Beyonce.
That's exciting.
I'm so
That's big
excited.
news.
I mentioned to my friend one time, I said, Cowboy Carter is one of the best albums of our time, and it truly changed me. And she calls me up 2 weeks later and she's like, what are you doing on Saturday, May 24th? And I'm like, I don't know. And she's like, well, I bought you a ticket to Beyonce. So do you want to go? And I was like, yes. So I'm like so excited and I like went and I tried to find a little Western outfit. I low key failed. It's so funny because if I was in Denver, I feel like I could have pulled something together so quickly, but there's like nothing here that is like cowboy esque. So
Uh-huh.
I'm just gonna go as my normal cute self, but I'm just so excited and I've never seen Beyonce. Have you guys ever seen Beyonce? Wow. Yeah, me either. So it just feels like such a
Jason
big
saw
deal.
her as in Destiny's Child, like 27,000 years
Right.
ago. So that's how long it's
Amazing.
been. Yeah. Baby Beyonce is what.
That's
Baby Beyonce.
Yeah.
That's almost more legendary, honestly, to see Destiny's
Yeah.
Child. Dare I say it, but
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
definitely my something good, and it's getting me through the
It's
week, and I
more than
can't
something
wait.
good. That's awesome.
Yeah.
that's a really big something good.
Yeah. Rebecca, what's your something good?
Well, it's the end of the year, which means Ellington has a performance next week. And so she's dancing in Swan Lake and at the Opera House on Saturday. And so that is always our something good because I always kind of get choked up and Jason does as well. Like his dad was actually born in like a slave shack on the edge of a plantation in Louisiana. And so anytime we get to the opera house and we see our daughter just, like two steps away, where she's like dancing ballet and like killing it on the stage, like it's just very emotional for us. And so that's really exciting. And then next week we're going to California for a family wedding. And I think the girls are in the wedding, so it's hard to not be so into their joy around it and getting to wear the fancy dresses and all of that. And it's really exciting.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
That's definitely a powerful visual of, you guys sitting and watching your baby dance and not being able to dance or show joy 2 generations before. That's quite the powerful image. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams.
It's crazy to think, when you look at your own parents and you're like, they are so ridiculous. And then you go one step further and you realize, okay, well, that's why, and then so like with his dad, he was so proud of the smallest things that, somebody who came from a more affluent situation would comment like, it's just this or it's just that, something really small. And then it took his own children seeing where he grew up to realize why all of those things that he made a big deal about were a big deal. And, if you're somebody who grows up in Colorado, especially of color, we're as a culture, I think, disconnected from the wider Black culture unless we reach out for it. And so to have that gift is really, to be able to recognize it really does feel like a gift to me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so your husband's family, they're from Louisiana, and your family's from Colorado, right? If I remember?
Yeah, my mom's family's in Pennsylvania. My dad's family's from Colorado. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I guess we never shared how we know you. Rebecca is a awesome mom at the school that Amber currently is at and the one I used to work at. So that's how we know her. We know her through her amazing, beautiful children. So she's a pretty badass if I do say so myself.
Love that for sure.
Sleepy badass these days.
And she does a lot of really incredible work too, if I can brag on her behalf, in the advocacy activism world, for moms against drunk driving. So she's a big deal. So thanks for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Be here.
So we will jump right in. So, Rebecca, for our listeners, how would you describe your racial identity? And then could you also add to like a little bit on that question of how has your identity kind of evolved over time, or has it always been the same?
Sure. It's funny. I think I struggle with the term, but technically would be considered biracial. My mother is white, my father is black. We were in between, the two of them. There is probably all sorts of other racial identities kind of looped in there as well. And I grew up in an area that was predominantly Mexican American and Chicano. And so for me, it's complicated, right? It's not like the way that I identify is, mixed. That's what I say. But my cultural identity is so influenced by growing up where I grew up in Colorado and where I went to college and having a mom who's from Pennsylvania and a dad who's from Pueblo, Colorado is very it's just a different dynamic. It's a different kind of black. It's a different kind of mix of things. But it often it's either mixed or biracial on paper, right?
Which actually is kind of brings me to our next question, which is what boxes do you check when you're filling out forms? That's a big experience when you're mixed
Yeah, I think
race.
about that a lot. Yeah. It's interesting because now there's more than one. You have a couple of options. You can say black and white. You can say multiracial. When I was a kid, it was very clear that you had to choose one. And I remember coming home from school and being so angry about having to choose one. And of course, in my true advocate nature, started a cause to change that on the school forms and landed myself as a member of the student school board for DPS, which is ridiculous. I think it's hard to I don't think any one of us feels solely one thing. And so it's really hard to box that in. And, if I put black, am I ignoring? I find this really challenging actually with my kids because Jason is black. I am mixed. Whenever we mark the kids down as black, I'm like, but they also have all of this other ancestry and that's not being, and it's tough. I can see that it sort of pains my mom when my youngest will say, well, how come Gaga's the only white one? And how come and she's just in that stage of like, she's really aware of that because she's around white kids a lot. Currently, the only one in her class she's the only one of color. And so she's more aware of it at the moment. I think when she transitions into kindergarten, has more of a mix and is able to see more different representation, that will change. But she's really aware and has mentioned a couple of times about my mom. And so I have always carried that weight too of like, which side am I ignoring if I put one of these options only, right?
That's so like deep and also so typical, I feel like, for biracial or mixed race people. I've definitely had that experience myself, especially since it's only been a couple years, like 2 years since Hispanic or Latino was considered to be a racial group. So now all of a sudden that's an option, but for most of my life it wasn't. It was like, well, I'm not white. I mean, I am half white, but you know what I mean? Like that's
Right.
not what does that say if I say I'm white? And then, lots of people who are within my community that are darker than me, what are they going to put black? Like no, they're like we're brown. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make sense. So I understand that. I do want to hear that story though of how you went to your like school board when you were a kid. What was that like? Like what grade were you in? I'm just so curious.
I think I was pretty young because I think it probably started in the actual school around third to fifth grade. And then in middle school is when I joined the school board. And that was one of those like your teachers just kind of recognize like this kid's doing a lot. Let's get her connected somewhere else. And so I think I was able to raise my voice there. But I was very aware of how I didn't totally fit in elementary school. We were probably one of two black kids or two black families. Both families were mixed. And so everybody else was either most people were Mexican, frankly, at that time in Northwest Denver. So a lot of Chicano families that openly identified as Chicano because they were a part of the Chicano movement. So I feel really comfortable and close with that part of the culture. And then our family, and then a couple of white families that were part of the early early gentrification before gentrification was a thing. And um, I don't know that I ever really identified at that age as black. I just sort of was not the things that were listed as options. And so I think that was really what sort of struck me to raise my voice, which I've never had a problem doing before.
Great.
Good.
I love that.
I do
I
too.
love that about you. Thanks for sharing. And I just think that's such an interesting story of like of just of advocacy and being young and being able to use your voice to make a difference. So I'm particularly touched by that. But it's a startling fact. It's not all that surprising. And they lump all black and brown kids in one category for this study that they did. But black and brown children who have to identify their race before taking the SAT perform lower than those that don't. So they did a test. So I don't know what it's like now, but when I took the SAT, and I'm gonna date, I always try to pretend I'm older than I am, but that was in like 2014. They had asked in the beginning of the exam what our racial ethnicity was, when you're doing your little check boxes or whatever. And then in grad school, I read that study, and it showed that students of color who are asked that question in the beginning of the exam perform lower on the exam versus asking it at the end, which I find to be
Interesting.
really interesting, right? So, like, there's this whole conversation of like the data is important, or I believe that the data is still important to collect because we have to know, how each group is doing and how to best support them. But I do think that there's something to be said about why are we asking on the exam and not like in your registration or a follow-up survey. Like it shouldn't.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
guess it's like one of the theories is because it increases students' anxiety when they're thinking.
I just heard this from a different study actually, and I wish that I could quote it accurately here. But essentially, what they were saying is that the idea that something racist is about to happen or something prejudice laced is about to happen is actually more damaging than the thing happening. So, going into a scenario, the weight that people put on themselves subconsciously about, like, for example, my event tomorrow with a room full of law enforcement. I am very open that that's like my least comfortable place to be, right? And so it puts a lot of stress on me because I'm anticipating. These are there's nothing gonna happen. People are very respectful of me in my position in this room. But I am carrying the weight of every experience that I've seen or witnessed or experienced with me when I walk into that room. And so the weight of what I'm carrying ahead of time, sort of anticipatory. It's almost like an anticipatory causes more strain. And so I think that's probably tied to like when somebody has to identify themselves, certainly a person of color, whenever you are reminded that you are that person, even as proud as you are, the act of reminding you that you are that person puts you back in your place. Does that make sense? So like if I do something and I raise my voice and then all of a sudden I'm presented as something tied to a stereotype, it reminds me like, oh, it doesn't matter how smart I am. It doesn't matter how much I've done or how much I try to fight for everyone. I'm still this person, that no matter what, how I look is how I show up first. And that is really hard to try to teach my kids. And I'm going to take us in a totally different direction, but it's really hard to try to teach my kids kind of that notion of like, I remember vividly my grandmother saying like, you always have to look semi presentable. I give myself a C minus since becoming a mom on this one, but you have to look presentable because you already have two strikes against you. You are a woman and you are a person of color. And so you have to like open the door. And Jason participates in this notion as well because he feels very similarly like if we look a certain way, it opens the doors for us. And it's hard to teach our kids that like other kids can show up not having combed their hair for like 17 years and they're fine and they get treated fine and they exist in the world fine. And that's not a problem. But if I were to send my kids to school with, food on their face or I did this at St. E's recently, but I did it and there was like a Kenzie had really chapped lips. I had chapped lips and one of the teachers right away was like, here's some chapstick. Like, don't go anywhere else until because she knew the code of like,
Mm,
you may just be rolling out of bed, but like, we've got to kind of look out for each other here because we do get treated differently. My hair is straightened when I do law enforcement events, when I do engage with certain communities. If I travel to Grand Junction, I'm going to have straight hair. I'm not going to take my curly hair there because I will get treated differently. So all of those pieces of both lived experience and, anticipated experiences carry that weight. So I could see a student doing the same thing subconsciously before they take this test, who's probably somewhere in their line somebody challenged them. And it could be a family member, like, what are you doing trying to go to school? None of us have been to school. Or it could be and that doesn't outrank all of the supportive family members, but there's always a voice somewhere along the way that challenges it. And then that's the voice that you hear when those questions are asked. Like,
Yeah.
are they going to actually see me, or are they going to see I'm just this another number here, you know? And
Yeah.
I don't know that everybody feels that the way that people of color feel that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do.
I think that that's like, they're defining like privilege for people who aren't people of color, for white people, is that like, that is, they get to navigate the world without ever having to think about how they're being presented or how people are going to like see them. Like you said, like your kids sending them to school, like there's a difference. There's those little subtle differences every day that it's like, you're like, how do I be mindful of how I'm teaching them or what I'm telling my kids at the same time, having to tell them that this is the world and this how is how it's set up. It's like, you don't want to like have to be like, you have to be presentable to the point where like they're, like it's a complex, but at the same time, it is the way that it is right now. That is the reality. And our kids don't always have the luxury of just showing up, even though I wish they could, because they should.
They deserve
We
to.
should be able to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm like,
I mean, we should be like
dressing my
those
babies every
teens
day.
in their love story.
Yeah,
Right.
They should just get to be in love, and that's it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They should just get to be in love.
they should.
Ooh, that's like in my mind now, is that they should just get to be those teens in that love story. And I mean at that point that you made too about like the perceived threat of something racist happening to you can hurt. Like that's another thing I'm thinking is are they like, is this going to be used to determine my score? Anyways, wow. All right.
Right. Okay, so our next question is, if you know it, can you share a little bit about like your parents' story and then like how their backgrounds shaped your identity? I know you mentioned like your dad grew up in Colorado and your mom's from Pennsylvania, but how did that really like shape your background, their experiences and coming together as a mixed race couple?
Yeah. Well, my dad's family was the first family in Pueblo to move into the very first set of projects. So we're not talking like any kind of like financial affluence happening there. It was a lot of cultural affluence and a lot of, really wonderful family connection. But yeah, my dad is one of eight, and most of them, half of them are still here and still in Colorado. And so we grew up around a really rich sense of family. And it was not just like, it's different because I think, I've had friends who will say, like, I grew up and was taught sort of how to keep your black card, quote unquote. And then, and I didn't get that experience, but my friends did. And so my family, that was like, we don't really care. We are revolved. That is how we operate. That is the family. And that was sort of how it was passed down to us, like what was acceptable, what was not. And it was very rigid and strict. I mean, strict down to like, you don't wear a hat in the house. You don't, we have a lot of comedy, but we're also like very honoring of our elders and very respectful. And then my mom's side was like upper middle class Catholic, Irish Catholic family from Pennsylvania that went to all Catholic schools. She grew up in private schools. She went to Penn State, and then moved out here on a whim with her girlfriends the week after graduation. And she was intending to get a job at the Broadmoor and never did. And my dad had already served in Vietnam, had already done the military. He lived in Germany for a while, came back, and was kind of like a bum on the couch of his mom's apartment and just like washing dishes and not really, he's partying too much. He didn't really know what he wanted to do, and they met working at a kitchen, and they didn't really like each other at first, and then slowly but surely, my dad would start walking my mom home to her house, but he also made it very clear that he didn't want kids, and which is a fact that we often remind him that he didn't want kids, and he's turned out to be the best dad. And my mom was very matter of fact. She was like, I need somebody who can like provide for me. Like, who is this guy who's leaving and all the time and living on his mom's couch? And slowly but surely, they just built a really authentic friendship that they still have to this day. And they've definitely gone through the ups and downs of marriage, but I think that friendship where they were able to show up honestly outside of their experiences, outside of their racial makeup as just individuals that met each other, which I think anybody who's in a mixed relationship kind of understands that notion of like, you don't really like, yes, those pieces are a part of you and they impact your relationship. But when you're doing that fall in love piece, you're really just getting to know someone. And I think that's sort of what they did. Um, my mom was very aware of how to raise us, and she was very aware of what her experience was as a mom raising Black kids, specifically around how did our hair get done, specifically my hair get done. And my grandmother sort of took her under the wing and did some teaching around hair and around what was acceptable and what was not. And, my mom was far away. She didn't have her family very close. So for us, became about our unit, our family unit here in Colorado. And so we did spend a lot of time with my dad's family, but then we went back in the summers and we were like those we were both seen as like the Black cousins, but also the artistic cousins and also the city cousins because she was from small town. So we had a couple of different identities that we could step into, at least within the family. It was usually those interactions with our cousins' friends that brought up like, well, how are you? One in particular, a cousin's friend met us at the Dairy Queen in small town Pennsylvania and was like, looked at my cousin and was like, well, are you Black? My cousin who's like blonde hair, blue eye, like, what are you talking about? And
Not
it
even
just,
knowing how to ask.
that's, the early 90s that was the response there, right? But, um, my brother and I just really had a sense of self outside of the stereotypes of what we were being told we should act like, which was both helpful and harmful later when, we went to college and didn't really fit in anywhere and, all of that. But whereas my husband grew up in, I think, a very different dynamic and learned to play the rules within the culture of what it meant to be Black because his family was Southern Black. And that is a different story. That is a different culture. And so even in us, in our relationship, we've had to navigate like the expectations that come with some of that exposure to whatever cultural norms we had. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you for that. That definitely answered my question.
And so when you were like a little girl growing up in Colorado, what was your experience like in school? I mean, you said that you kind of grew up in a predominantly Chicano area, so it's not
Uh-huh.
like you were necessarily at like a PWI, but what was that like?
Right. It was interesting. I don't know that my brother looks Mediterranean. And so I don't know that he really identified as Black until he lived overseas and people treated him as though he were a Moor, which was interesting because we don't really look like that, but he does favor Mediterranean imagery more than I do. And I don't know where that comes from because that's not in the mix that we know about. But for me, I was the one with the more coarse hair. And so I had a harder time like matching my friends and boys are different than girls. Girls really do look at identity through like, can I do the same thing that my friends are doing? And so I really struggled with that. And I, was called the N word in elementary school and didn't, had to, I knew very clearly what the weight of that word was and how harmful it felt to me at the time. But I couldn't wrap my head around why that was happening. And then as I aged, it put me in a position of like, we talked about those teens who are dating and wanting to, fall in love. And I always put myself in the category of just the friend because I didn't match the things that were being portrayed by the media as being, attractive at that time, right? There wasn't a lot of representation of what I looked like. And I started to pick up that a lot of my friends also were not comfortable with the notion of an interracial interaction. And so I was kind of this friended entity all through
Mm.
middle school, high school, and I carried that with me in college. And some of my guy friends from that time still talk about how they could see that identity on me in a strange way because I went to school in the South. I didn't match with the Black girls that had grown up in the South. I didn't match with, but a lot of people were intrigued by me because nobody had ever seen a Colorado person in Arkansas, you know? So they didn't really know what to do with me. I didn't really know what to do with them. So I think it definitely painted my experience always growing up. And I have vivid memories of like going into a dressing room with my mom and announcing loudly that it was my mom so that nobody would think that I was being, you know, inappropriately
Mm,
impacted by some random, and so, or like we would get things. I have memories of like things that would say one per family, and we always got two. And, that was another childhood memory that always sort of stuck with me. It's like, but we felt like a family, but the world didn't see that, was
yeah.
sort of the reaction. I think that's changed. And I mean, Amber, you would know better as you are raising kids in this dynamic now, but I think that's changed even from my kids will look at me and be like, "What do you mean you didn't have all of these products for your hair? And what do you mean that you didn't, see yourself on TV or even in children's books?" And we'll go back and we'll look through some of our old children's books and realize there's not a single kid of color in the class. If it is, it's like a very stereotyped, very like purple black human in, in the imagery. I feel good that my kids have more exposure to the rainbow of color that exists in the world and that they can see themselves and find themselves. It doesn't mean they're not without their own strains too. I think my younger daughter has slightly darker tone, has more coarse hair. She's already picking it up differently than her sister.
Mm,
And so I think, it's just something I'm aware of, and it's something, you know, I can identify with a little bit, but I think they have more exposure than I had, which is feels like progress.
mm,
I would agree. I do think that that we've come a long way, but some of the stuff that you were saying, I was like agreeing with like 100% because even though like obviously I have two black parents, so I didn't grow up. I'm not biracial, but I did grow up as a black girl in Colorado as well, and so I've been reading this book called Token Black Girl, and it talks about how especially black girls see themselves, or I think that it can just apply just as easily to biracial, black girls with like we weren't represented in the books. We were the only ones in our classrooms, so in some cases, and especially around relationships, I definitely knew that the boys weren't interested in the dark skinned black girl, let alone the black girl, but like then the dark skin, so then it was like that extra layer of colorism that also comes into like within the black culture. And I too went to school down south from Colorado. So I was, even though I was a black girl and I was blending in with like on appearance level with other black people, as soon as I opened my mouth, it was like, oh, where are you from? Like, what is going
Yes.
on here? I was like,
Yes.
Colorado.
Yeah.
There's black
We're
people.
like,
Like, you
"What?"
talked about this on the podcast.
Yeah.
Like, people would ask me, like, "There's black people in Colorado?" Yeah,
Yes. Like 15. There's 15,
yeah. I
you
was
know?
like,
Y'all choose families.
Yeah.
they would really be like,
That's
"What
it.
is going on?" Like, I'm like,
Yeah.
we're in Colorado. We're there, but like, we were so spread apart too at the same time. And I didn't. My parents took us out of the predominantly black schools and neighborhoods into like even more white, predominantly white schools. So like, I grew up in like like lower school, elementary, middle school was mostly like a race of different types of people or like a group of students. I definitely did not experience that like late middle school, high school. So I definitely, there's a lot of things that you said that I was like, oh yeah, I know all about that person of color experience in Colorado. And then also just like in the 90s, like not seeing ourselves represented in TV and movies and books. And then like the books that I did read and the TV shows that I did watch, it was always like so much violence, so much like the black experience was bad. You know what I mean? And so
Mhm.
like in
Mhm.
Token Black Girl, she talks about how she was constantly trying to like not identify, even though she's clearly a black girl. She was like, I didn't want to like fit in that mold of like the black image that was being portrayed to us as kids growing up
Mhm.
in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s. So
Well, and I didn't. As a mixed kid, I did not fit anybody's
Mhm.
mold, and there wasn't a mold, And so, like, I think that is something that has struck me in my older years of like, there's this beautiful surge of black beauty in Black Girl Magic, all of that, which I love to watch, but also didn't feel like was mine to own. And so I've kind of struggled with that in raising my own two girls who like hear that because they have, you know, a plethora of family members that feed that into them, and they should carry themselves with that joy that they deserve to have. And I still like I find myself so struggling with um because even within Black culture there's a rainbow of tone and all of that, but there's a very distinct difference between a lighter toned Black person and a mixed person. And it's silly that it exists, but it does exist. And so it comes up a lot when I'm around the Black community because it's that same piece. Like the minute I open my mouth, they're like, "Oh, who and where and how?" And part of that's Colorado, and part of that's being raised by whom part of that is that my name is Becky. And that is a
Right.
really hard name to have as a Black girl. Thank you to some of the thousands rappers and Beyonce. Thank
Becky with
you
the good hair.
as well. Yeah, that kind of made it a bigger struggle for me. But it is something that I sort of personally I don't talk to anybody about this, but I haven't really acknowledged it outside of this is that, there have been moments where I look sort of enviously at my children who can identify and jump in, even though I think Ellington would say that she doesn't quite feel like she fits with even the Black girls in her class. And so she has this dynamic where she, looks for other ways to identify with people. But it's interesting. Like, I'm so excited to finally see this representation. And it also is still so foreign to me, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And I feel a lot of what you're saying resonates with me personally as a biracial person, but also in through history. Like I'm thinking about the fact of like receiving judgment as a biracial person from both the Black community and the white community. And it reminds me of like the rootedness in slavery and how when enslaved people were, forced to produce these children who were technically biracial, right? Because they were a result of rape, those children were judged by both the Black community who were enslaved and as like a reminder of the trauma, and from the white people who that's another reminder, especially white women who are like, that's a reminder that my husband fornicated
Cheated
or
or whatever.
cheated,
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
they
yeah.
thought, right, with another woman, even though it was rape and whatnot. And so therefore they disregarded those children. um I just felt like that was an important connection to bridge of like that's carried on and probably now subconsciously, but it's an interesting kind of like dynamic. And on the representation front, I feel like that's what's so frustrating to me about this whole like backlash against DEI is like it really has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. It's only been 10 years since I graduated high school. And like we still didn't have that really representation. I know you guys had it
No.
worse, I would dare say, but even for us, like I had Ugly Betty. That was my big Latina role model, was someone being called ugly,
Hmm.
Ugly Betty, right? Like Desperate
We had
Housewives, Eva
Princess Tiana,
Longoria.
who was a frog,
Right, right. Yeah, and the Voodoo
who I
Man was the
love,
villain, right?
but was a frog.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly, exactly. And even that, every like person of color that was like a Disney something is like turned into an animal. Like there was that red, they just came out with something, it was like Red Bear or something. It was like a little girl
Red
and she's
Panda.
Red Panda. They turn her into a panda and she's Asian. Like Mulan was turning into a man. Like, all of those characters, of course I'm blanking on other ones, but they're either turned into an animal or they're supposed to be doing something besides being their, true self. So
Themselves. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like it's interesting. And I think we've now seen a great amount of representation in people of color broadly. But I think what was missing and is happening a little bit is that mixed race representation. I think that's the next step, right? And how to like, yeah, like because there was that picture, I remember this was a long time ago. They did that Time magazine cover where it was like what the average American is gonna look like in the year whatever the
Yeah.
future, and it's a person who's mixed race. So it's like we talk about this a lot on the show, like more and more people are being born that are mixed race, so we're going to get to a point where there's not such clear boundaries of what race
Right.
people identify. It's not black and white anymore.
Because can it just be two people
Right,
who fall in love, right?
exactly.
Or like,
Yeah,
or lust, or whatever it is that
yeah,
lands us there. But
something not
I
traumatic.
mean,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I think you said that like earlier when you were like like when your parents, when you're talking about their story and how when people are two people fall in love, like that really should be the focus. And obviously, like things do come up. We do talk about like how you navigate experiences in the world based on how you look and like what your race is. But I'm married to a white male, and being a black woman and him being a white male weren't like the center of our like building of our relationship. And I've been like joking with Nikki like how I'm having like like a black girl awakening. Obviously, I've always known I was black, but I think that that's shifting how I talk. And my husband, like when I started talking about this more, he's like, "Wow, like you never talked about race before, like this much."
I think that's because you're from Colorado.
Yeah, and I was like, because I was
Yeah.
always centering whiteness, you know what I mean? So I
Yep.
thought I wasn't supposed to talk about race. And even like I think at the current school I'm at, like I started wearing like Black History Month shirts. And that was like the first time I really did that. And I was like a little nervous around my husband, like, oh my gosh, is he gonna be like, what are you? And he was like, that's so cool. Let's go find you some more. But I was like, oh, like I thought he was gonna be like, why are you wearing all these Black History Month shirts? And
Yeah,
he was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
I found one, or here's one from your college, you know. And I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't him that was telling me not to do it. It was me centering it. Me, like, so
Yeah.
it doesn't come up.
It's funny that you say that. I mean, my husband is in the events industry and he deals with a lot of like just out of college. I'm picking on the blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm not trying to, but that's a lot of who he works
White
with right
people.
now. And so he talks about how he has to all of those steps to like sell himself. And somebody, and a DJ who doesn't look like him could walk in and get paid higher and and so he has also been trying to find his space, and like he talks about it a lot. And I realized the reason that I didn't focus on it so much is in some ways I didn't focus on it so much was, my dad would tell us stories about racism without it would be so covert, like he told us a story about going out to Pennsylvania for the very first time to meet my mom's family who had never they knew one black person in the town, and maybe a couple in the town over. And my mom had babysat for the town, like family that happened to be of color. And the thing that saved my dad was that the Broncos lost to the Steelers that day. So my dad walks up to their house. My grandfather opens the door, lets my mom in, slams the door, opens the door and says, if the Steelers win, you can marry my daughter. And thankfully, I mean, I guess they won. And so here we are. But that was the story that, it was about football. It wasn't about race. And so as we got older, we got different pieces of the story, of course. But as young kids, it was about that human interaction over the differences being highlighted. And so I think that gave me a different shield almost of being comfortable in talking about these issues. I think that's why I dive into them, but I don't feel as harmed in some ways. You know what I'm saying? Like I feel like I can dive in, whereas I've been around people who even, my husband is very aware and harmed. Like it hurts his feelings differently than it hurts mine. And it hurts my youngest's feelings differently than it hurts my oldest. And so I think part of that is a privilege that we have. It's a privilege that I hold as a mixed person that he does not hold as a black man. And so I think it's just so multi-layered and complex on so many levels. And I think if you go back through history, every interaction between two peoples, two families, two tribes, two, whatever however your band of people identified, whenever there was something new, there it added that layer of complexity and new cultural elements. And so I don't think that's unique to the black and white experience or even the American mixed experience. I think what's unique is our inability to actually like talk about it, celebrate it, and engage with it. And that's just what we're learning to do now, which is too bad that DEI is off the table all of a sudden, because
Right.
I think that's really what we were leaning into is just how magical that has been and can be for people. Uh,
And it's a threat to white supremacy, and it's a threat to the white dominant culture.
100%.
They don't want us to love ourselves and be happy because then they can't sell
Mhm.
us anything. They can't sell us
Right.
anything to try to be white. So,
Yeah. I
but
always tell my kids, we are magical. We have magic in us.
you do.
We create life. We create art, culture, music, all of those things. Anybody does, right? But we have within us the blood of ancestors that continue to survive through the craziest things. And that is what we talk about all of the time, that like when you're getting like, you are not entering into this challenge on your own. You have the blood of all that came before us that give us that power. And I think that that's something that I learned in my 20s when I started singing in a group whose sole purpose was to elevate the history of the Black Negro spiritual. And so I learned a lot. And the thing that struck me, I'll never forget this, was like the first rehearsal. And the teacher was like, I love her. She just released her well, she died last year, and then they released an autobiography of her. And she was this spicy woman from Texas, and she taught at George Washington High School. And I mean, like, she was like educator, like, had been through it. She said, "Don't worry, you know the songs." I was like, "I don't know these songs. I've never, I grew up in Colorado." I'm like, "I grew up in Colorado." This is my excuse all the time. Like, "Are you sure?" And you start hearing them and they take over. Something takes over. The spirit takes over, whatever it is takes over, and you know the songs. You know this. You like get these visions of like your ancestors singing them in the kitchen and your grandmother and whatever. And it was that experience that really reminded me of the strength that I have because of the people that came before me. And that has been my guiding force both for myself and for my girls. But it's some days it's I mean, there have definitely been some things recently that have made that harder to remember. But I try. I know that I think that's the joy that carries me, is like some call it disassociation. I'm calling it joy, but that carries me through this chaotic time.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Uda.
That is beautiful, and I think, like, I don't think it's disassociation at all. I think it is joy, and if you think about, like, the meaning of the spiritual, that was the point, is to stay close to God and have joy when you're being oppressed and enslaved, so that's beautiful.
Well, and it wasn't really God. It has become God. But what it was your connection to your sense of self prior to being cut off. So slaves would use the words of from the Bible as a means of communicating versus because owners would just think that they were just, we're finally getting them. They're being good Christian, blah, blah, blah. But slaves were like, just kidding. So Black people have been using that sort of
It's awesome.
Black colloquialism from the beginning of time in this country as a means of survival because they can speak an entire language. It's that code switching. That's the beginning of that. And so they were able to use lean and then it did become, I mean, the Black church developed and it became a thing that was really supportive to a lot of people and also really harmful to others. But that idea of connecting to our ancestors through song, through food, through dance, that is how they survived when they were disconnected from their entire families. That is how they survived, was recreating it here. And so I think that if they could do that, I can do whatever I have to do. You know?
Amen.
Love it.
Yeah, that gave me, like, chills, and I was, like, tearing up as you were talking about, like, seeing your ancestors in the kitchen, and that's beautiful.
Everybody has their sacred. That's the thing that I get challenged by with this conversation around DEI is like every culture, every place, regardless, even if your culture was the centered, privileged culture, there's sacred there too. And so I think learning how to communicate and talk about that, you wearing a Black History Month shirt and finally embracing what's sacred about that for you doesn't take away from your husband or from your previous versions of yourself. You know what I mean?
This has been really great. I do have a question. So there's been like this, like, I guess, social media trend where, and I wanted to know your thoughts on it, Rebecca, as a mixed race woman, but where people, like somebody like basically was like, people who have red hair or also known as gingers are Black people. They're like, gingers are like Black people of white people. And so there was like, I know, it's the whole thing. But there are Black gingers, there are Black people with red hair. And so there's been like this discourse because a lot of mixed race people have been speaking up and feeling like they're feeling really offended by, like this embracing of gingers as part of like the Black community, but like not necessarily embracing mixed race people as part of, one community or the other. Because I know that that's something that they, the mixed race that you navigate as far as for like, do I fit? I don't really necessarily fit into like this white community, but I also don't fit into the Black community. but not being embraced by either one. And then like having, one race of people saying like, oh, but these white people, because they have red hair and they've been rejected, are part of us. Like, I don't know, what do you think about
Well, one, I just need us to turn the internet off for like,
Turn the TV off.
that? Right?
turn it off just a little bit of time because everything's such a reach. It's funny. I mean, Irish people in this country were seen as Black for a long time, and they were actually positioned slightly above free Blacks financially at first because they were used as cheap labor to then control. That's how cops started, frankly, was you had these fraternities that were then given power over freed Blacks, and then with the idea that they needed to control this population. And you gave them just slightly and a little bit of power, even though they were also going home and sleeping in, tenements, and they were sleeping in, waiting, trying to send money home to get the rest of their families. And so I think there's a lot of, and I say the Irish because one of the stereotypes is that red hair kind of thing. That's not for everyone, obviously. None of my family members, none of the Irish side really have that. But it's interesting that that has made a resurgence because there is a link between at least the experience of Irish in America and Black in America, or freed Black in America. But I think it's silly because there's such a rainbow already within the Black community already. And it just goes to highlight the lack of awareness around colorism that already exists. But I do think those trends, I think what it really shows is that everybody is seeking somewhere to fit in.
Yeah.
Everyone is seeking what's their trend that they can jump in on and do the video and do the dance with. And, and that's been both the blessing and the curse of social media, is that people have been able to find like-minded individuals to our demise, but also that it's highlighted how much variety really exists in the world, and how someone in this part of the world could have a doppelganger on the other side of the world. That somebody will send you a video and say like, oh, this looks like you, and you're like, where's this person? This person's in India. How do we have the same you know genetic face happening, right? So it's got its benefits and its challenges, but I think with everything, without that context of like colorism, the fact that there are people that are redheaded in all cultures, how that came to be. I think there's an entire subset of community members in Mexico that when the Irish really struggled here, they went to fight the war in Mexico, and now there's a whole community in Mexico of people that have very Irish traits
Yep.
and are very Mexican. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
that mix exists everywhere. So it is interesting. I think most of those trends they need context for people, but you can't get a context, lesson in TikTok. That's not how that, yeah.
No, you're right. And I think that like you really named it as far as for like ultimately people are trying to find somewhere that they fit in. And I think when the trend first started, a lot of like people that were just had red hair were like literally making videos of like crying and saying we feel like we're being embraced by someone, and we feel so grateful for this, and
Hmm.
then there's other people who are like, no, like you mentioned, like that the history of the Irish and like how, police officers were even started, and they're like, absolutely not. Like, these are not our friends. Like, we are not embracing them. So there's been a lot of discourse. I think it's interesting, but I just really wanted to hear your perspective on it, especially as a mixed race person trying to like navigate or have navigated growing up. Like, where do I fit in? And then like to hear like, oh, but there's this whole other set of people that aren't necessarily even Black or specifically Black or mixed race, and they're like being accepted into like one side or the other. Just wanted to know your, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a kid, it was the or question. You're either this or you're that, and you're neither enough, right? So you're not Black enough. You're definitely not white enough. But then at the same time, now the conversation is, I am and I am
Uh-huh.
this and this and also that and also a little bit of this. And I think, it gives people that expanded sort of view that all of us are more than just the one thing. And what's hard, especially for my generation, I think it's hard because we grew up in such a boxed space of like, you can only choose one, right? That's how that like came about, was on those childhood forms. We could only choose one. And now we're unlearning that to realize we can actually choose multiple things because we are multiple things and we should be proud equally of all of those things. But for a mixed person, it does feel hurtful, I'm sure, to hear a group of, you know, Black people say, like, yeah, come on over, to somebody who's ginger, for example. But then we were never fully enough there.
Mhm.
It wouldn't be American if it wasn't like, contradictory of sorts. So I think it's
We're
sort of our
laughing.
cultural dynamic. So I think it's,
I do have a hot take, if I may. As the
yeah.
resident, I'm trying to think of the non-police term for woke police. As the resident woke officer,
Huh? Yeah, let's hear it.
I struggle with this. I struggle with this, and not to discredit the Irish and their history, which is totally true and valid. And actually, I really appreciate the Irish community because of their stance on Palestine and their long-lasting support
Yeah.
of the Palestinian
Yep.
struggle. So they have no problems in my book. But I question the intention. And the reason why I question the intention is because the way I've seen it portrayed on social media is it's kind of like they're getting a pass from the Black community. And it's like, it's this whole like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm cool now. Like, you'll see the videos and it's like, I don't know, like a redheaded person like just dancing or whatever. And it's like me finding out I'm Black and I'm invited to the cookout.
But they still,
And it's just like that. I question that intention because it's like, are you just happy you're being accepted by this group of people, which is such a pure hearted thing? And I'm sure that there are people that are. But then I'm like, is that it? Or do you feel like you are now like saved from being canceled or being accused of being racist? Or like, do you know what I mean? I guess the way that they're talking about their proximity to Blackness isn't like, we're both oppressed, let's be friends. It's like, you guys are cooler than me, and I like that you're
yeah.
acknowledging that I'm cool. Do you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
question it.
I
Like I'm like,
saw one I
mm,
saw one comment on one of those videos, which, like, frankly, they don't really have they're just 30-second
yeah,
silliness,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Of
yeah,
like, that have lasting appeal and are
yeah,
harmful.
sure.
I will give you that. But I think I saw somebody comment, like, if you rearrange the letters in ginger, it spells the N word. And that changed the whole thought for me, where it it adds if that's the intention, it could be someone's intention that nobody's picking up on, but then it's become this like viral thing, that this is how Becky became a bad word. It was somebody made a rap about it, and then that became a bad word, even though most people thought it was like Becky with the good hair, like funny kind of thing. It has this really negative connotation. And so I think if we wanted to dive into that part of the conversation, that probably could exist. And it probably really does in this world, in this version of the world. But that's people are not picking up on it because they're picking up on, I'm finally accepted somewhere, even
Yeah.
though underhandedly, maybe it has this really racist undertone. So I see your point with that
Yeah,
too, Nikki. I think that's definitely valid. And I didn't, I was not paying that much attention to
right.
that trend until I saw that comment. And then I was like, oh man,
Yeah,
here's
like
another
something is just like
example,
they took it too far. It's like they take it too
Yeah.
far, and I like just.
Yeah.
Somebody
It
always
could be
does.
my underlying distrust for white people. I will say that, and I will own that.
That's
That
fair.
that could be why.
That's fair.
But something
That's
doesn't
fair.
sit right. You know.
I mean, I think we're living in a world where there's a lot of calculated behavior, and we have technology that helps to get that calculated behavior out there. And so I think it's probably most damaging to young people who haven't been through the versions of themselves yet to determine what rings true for them. I mean, not that I've been through all the versions of myself either, but I think, even in this discussion we've talked about how the various lenses I can see myself in. I don't think you really think you can identify lenses, but I don't know if you see yourself fully in those lenses until you are older. I think you're just kind of figuring it out along the way. And for kids who are seeing that ginger thing and they're seeing it as like a playful thing, it could be a playful thing. And it could also be a really harmful thing that we just don't know yet.
Well, as we start to kind of close out, and oh my goodness, I hope you'll come back someday and talk to us some more because I feel like we didn't even get to
What about
tip of
this?
the iceberg. But as we start to wrap things up, I am curious, what advice would you give for anyone who's navigating the world as a mixed race or biracial person and is just not sure how to do that? It's a thing. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think my advice is always the same, and that is somebody just made up rules, right? It's just somebody like you who made up the rules that we all live by now, which means that they can be changed. And I think that's the thing that, or they can be challenged. And I think that's the thing that has been helpful to me as I navigate those feelings of not being enough and those feelings of not really knowing how to communicate that there's not really a group that I identify with because mixed, everybody's mixed, but mixed being biracial is challenge it's different, it's challenging, and it's in that there's not a set culture to identify with. There's no, like, I don't have a mixed history shirt that I could wear. You know what I'm saying? So, like, trying to navigate all of those pieces, um, by saying, like, the rules exist, there are rules, but maybe those rules don't apply here, they don't apply to me, or we can change them now, has given me a lot of freedom to really figure out what fits me now and what fits the needs of my children who are being raised in a different world than I was being raised in. And that it doesn't have to be and like, or it can be you know, I don't have to be black or white in the world. I can be both. And that has been freeing.
It's beautiful.
It is. I love that. I love your whole outlook on, just navigating the world, and especially what you shared about, just like the rules and that freedom of, I don't necessarily have to follow this like social rule or like this, like something that's been put on us just because somebody else said this is how these people live, or this identity lives. It's like, no, I get to decide and define how I'm showing up. I get to decide and define what I look like. And I think that is so powerful, especially for children who are still trying to figure out who they are. And they're also growing up as, mixed race or multiracial. And it's like, you get to define how you want to identify because it's your life and it's your identity. All right. So when we close out, Rebecca, we usually just set intentions, and our intentions can be similar to like our something good, but like something that like we're looking forward to, something that we want to put out there in the world and for ourselves. It could be like for this next week, or just want to continue putting out this energy. So we want to actually have our guest of honor share, like, what is your intention as we close out our this episode?
I'm going to set myself up, I think. When I talk about my experience with singing Black spirituals, one, I don't sing very often anymore. And I don't get this is why I'm so thrilled that you guys are doing this, because I don't get to talk about this kind of thing very often anymore. And both are so near and dear to my heart. So I think my intention is to weave that back into my daily life.
That's beautiful.
I'm gonna check in on that and be like, how's the singing coming back in
Let's try it.
with the few days we have left to like run into each other
Yeah,
this year.
absolutely.
Nikki, what about you? What's your intention?
Well, that's a really beautiful one. My intention, something I'm really working on, is reframing my identity outside of work. I think that the work I do and get paid for is so like integral to who I am that I forget that like I'm a person outside of this capitalist system. And it's okay to like I'm still going to love and do my job and do it well, but I can also like be me outside of that. So like I'm really excited about Cowboy Carter. I'm excited about like just having a long weekend. And that's the only thing I have going on. So I'm gonna really allow myself some rest and really just try to think of like what do I want to do outside of work for fun. So that's my intention. How about you, Amber?
Well, I am going to continue with something that I have been doing for, I want to say, a week and a half now. I had to create a rest plan, um, and it's sort of evolving into more of a joy plan because I feel like I had to first define what rest meant for me, and it involved like, I think, just filling my bucket with things that like feel good to me. That's what rest felt like, to like do things that make me feel good, to take my mind off of like the weight of the world. And so my intention is to continue to define what that looks like and to keep, I want them to be habits because I'm doing them for myself. And not because I'm trying to like get to like this end goal, helping me navigate and how to deal with like, the things that I read and see and hear and deal with on a regular basis. And like, just making that time for myself, like reading more and, just daydreaming really has been something that I've been trying to practice of just being able to just sit and be quiet and think about whatever I want to think about for a few minutes and not have it be like, oh, but I'm going to like, I look lazy. It's like, no, I'm resting. I'm, filling my bucket. I'm being intentional about taking a moment to center myself and find something that brings me joy and peace. So I want to continue.
It's hard to do,
It is so hard
but
to
it's
do.
so worth it. It's so worth it. Yeah.
It's hard to do.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, listeners. This is the Mixtapes. I'm your co-host Amber, joined by my co-host Nikki. Thank you so much for tuning in again. Please follow us on Instagram, the Mixtapes Pod on Instagram. We also have an email, mixtapespod@gmail.com. If you're interested, definitely send people our way or just tune in as fans and listeners. Rebecca, please make sure that you spread the word about how you were on this amazing podcast with anybody that you have in your circle, and definitely feel free to send them our way as well. We'd love to. We're always looking for guests to have on our show, or people. It doesn't necessarily have to be people that are mixed race. It could be people that are in interracial relationships, people that maybe have transracially adopted, or even individuals that are just raising biracial children. So
Yeah.
just we're looking for a plethora of guests to kind of share their stories because we are just story collectors and we just want to make sure that people have a platform to be able to talk about their experiences, especially in this time where our voices are constantly being silenced. We want to keep pushing back and we want to keep telling the stories and experiences of everyone.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you for coming on, Rebecca.
Peace and love, y'all.